The divorce papers hit the kitchen counter with a sound that changed everything. Graeme's calm voice cut through my protests like a blade. "You said I'd never measure up to Liam. Congratulations, Cressida. You were right about one thing. I'll never be the kind of man who stays with the cheater." The bistro buzzed with Friday night energy as our family dinner unfolded like a slow-motion disaster. I should have known better than to push Graeme when he was already distant, but 8 years of marriage had taught me exactly which buttons to press when I wanted a reaction. "Mum, why is Dad so quiet?" Maya asked, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the tension at our table. Graeme's mother Edith shot me a warning look while my sister Ria scrolled through her phone, pretending not to notice the Arctic chill between my husband and me. Graeme mechanically cut his steak, those methodical movements that had once seemed stable, now irritating me beyond reason. 3 weeks of sleeping in separate rooms, 3 weeks of him treating me like a stranger in our own home, and I was done with his silent treatment. "Your father's just tired, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light while anger simmered beneath the surface. "He's been working so hard lately. Haven't you, Graeme?" He looked up briefly, those grey eyes that used to warm when they met mine, now flat and unreadable. "Just focused on what matters, Cressida." The dismissal in his tone made something snap inside me. I'd been walking on eggshells for weeks, ever since he'd started questioning my late nights at the office, my sudden need for privacy with my phone, my friendship with Liam. The guilt I'd been carrying transformed into defiance. "Well, at least some of us know how to show emotion," I laughed, the sound harsh in the intimate restaurant setting. "Remember when we used to actually talk to each other? When you used to make me laugh?" Edith's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Cressida, perhaps this isn't the place." "No, it's fine," I interrupted, the wine making me bold and reckless. "We're all family here. We can be honest, right? I mean, Graeme's always so concerned about honesty these days." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Graeme's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. His silence only fueled my frustration. "You know what the problem is?" I continued, my voice getting louder despite Maya's confused expression. "Some people just accept mediocrity. They settle for good enough instead of fighting for something better." "Cressida," Graeme's voice was low, warning, but I was past caring about warnings. The comparison had been dancing on my tongue for weeks, and tonight it finally broke free. "I mean, take my ex Liam. Now there's a man who knows how to make a woman feel alive. He listens when I talk. He makes me laugh. He remembers the little things that matter." I took another sip of wine, enjoying the way Graeme's knuckles whitened around his knife. "Some men just have that spark, you know? That passion. They don't just go through the motions of being a husband." The table fell silent. Maya looked between her father and me with growing alarm. Ria finally looked up from her phone, her eyes wide. Edith set down her utensils with deliberate precision. "And some men," I continued, the words pouring out like poison. "Well, they try their best, but they just never quite measure up, do they?" The silence that followed was deafening. Graeme slowly placed his napkin beside his plate and stood up, his movements controlled and precise. "Graeme, where are you going?" Edith asked, concern evident in her voice. "I've lost my appetite," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Cressida, you've made your feelings perfectly clear. Thank you for the honesty." He kissed Maya's forehead gently. "Be good for your mother, sweetheart. I'll see you at home." As he walked away, I felt a moment of panic. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to fight back, to show some emotion, to prove he cared enough to argue. "Graeme, wait," I called after him, but he didn't turn around. "Cressida," Edith said, her voice cold as winter, "what have you done?" I forced a laugh, trying to salvage the situation. "Oh, come on, he's being dramatic. It was just a joke. He knows I didn't mean anything by it." But even as I said the words, I could see the judgment in every face around the table. Maya's eyes were filling with tears, and Ria looked like she wanted to disappear. "Mummy, why did you say those mean things about Daddy?" Maya whispered. They weren't mean, baby. Mummy was just teasing. Daddy's being too sensitive. But the lie tasted bitter in my mouth, and as I looked around the table at the shocked faces of my family, I realized that my joke might have just cost me everything. The drive home was silent except for Maya's occasional sniffles from the back seat. When we pulled into our driveway, Graeme's car was already there, but the house felt empty despite his presence. The house felt different when we walked through the front door. Graeme was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear movement upstairs, the deliberate sounds of someone gathering belongings. "Is Daddy leaving?" Maya asked, her small hand clutching mine. "Of course not, sweetheart. Daddy just needs some space to cool down. You know how he gets when he's upset." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Graeme had never walked away from a fight before. Usually, his response to conflict was to become even more methodical, more controlled. This silence felt different, final in a way that made my stomach clench with unease. I tucked Maya into bed with extra stories and promises that everything would be fine in the morning. But as I made my way to our bedroom, I found it empty. Graeme's pillow was missing from the bed, along with his reading glasses and the book he'd been working through. The guest room door was closed, a sliver of light visible underneath. I knocked softly. "Graeme, can we talk about this like adults?" Silence. "I know you're upset, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. It was just a stupid comment. I didn't mean anything by it." Still nothing. I tried the handle, but the door was locked. In 8 years of marriage, Graeme had never locked a door against me. The reality of what I'd done began to sink in, replacing my defiant anger with something that felt uncomfortably like fear. My phone buzzed with a text from Ria. "What the hell was that tonight? Mum called. She's furious." Before I could respond, another message appeared, this one from Edith. "I hope you're proud of yourself. That man has done nothing but love you and Maya, and this is how you repay him. Shame on you, Cressida." The messages kept coming throughout the night. Friends who'd been at nearby tables, family members who'd heard about the scene secondhand. Each one felt like a small judgment, a crack in the foundation of the life I'd built. At 2 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep. The house was too quiet, too empty, despite Graeme being just down the hall. I padded downstairs for a glass of water and froze when I saw light spilling from his study. Through the partially open door, I could see him sitting at his desk, papers spread out in neat piles. Bank statements, insurance documents, Maya's school records, all organized with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. "Graeme," I whispered, pushing the door open wider. He looked up, and for a moment, I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Not anger. I could have handled anger. This was worse. This was the look of a man who'd made a decision. "What are you doing?" I asked, stepping into the room. "Research," he said simply, turning back to his papers. "Research for what?" He didn't answer, just continued sorting through documents with maddening calm. I moved closer, trying to see what he was working on, but he gathered the papers into a neat stack and slipped them into a folder. "Graeme, please, talk to me. We can work through this." Finally, he looked at me again, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Can we, Cressida? Can we really work through the fact that you're in love with another man?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. I never said that. You didn't have to." He stood up, closing the folder with deliberate care. "You said I don't measure up to him, that he makes you feel alive in ways I apparently can't, that he has something I don't." I was angry. People say things when they're angry. Do they? He moved toward the door, then paused. "Because the thing about anger, Cressida, is that it tends to strip away the lies we tell ourselves. It reveals what we really think, deep down. That's not fair, isn't it?" He turned to face me fully, and I was struck by how tired he looked. "How long, Cressida? How long have you been comparing me to him and finding me lacking?" I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words stuck in my throat. because the truth was, I had been comparing them. Every time Liam made me laugh at work, every time he remembered something Graeme forgot, every time he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. "It's not what you think," I said finally. "Then tell me what it is." But I couldn't, because explaining would mean admitting to the lunches that had turned into dinners, the texts that had become increasingly personal, the way my heart raced when Liam's name appeared on my phone. It would mean acknowledging that somewhere along the way, I'd started an emotional affair and convinced myself it was justified. "I think," Graeme said when my silence stretched too long, "that we both need some time to figure out what we really want." He walked past me toward the stairs, leaving me alone in his study with the lingering scent of his cologne and the terrible realization that I might have just destroyed my marriage over a man who would probably disappear the moment things got complicated. Monday morning at the customer service office felt like walking into a minefield. The weekend had passed in a blur of tense silence and Maya's increasingly worried questions about why Daddy was sleeping in the guest room. I'd tried calling Graeme Sunday night, standing outside the locked guest room door like a beggar, but he'd simply said he needed more time to think. The calm in his voice was somehow worse than if he'd been screaming. "Well, look who decided to show up," came Liam's voice from behind me as I settled at my desk. "Rough weekend?" Liam Archer had always been attractive in that dangerous way that smart women should avoid. Dark hair, easy smile, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to work too hard for anything. We dated briefly before I met Graeme, and when he'd started working in our department 6 months ago, it had felt like fate. "You could say that," I muttered, powering up my computer and trying to ignore the way my coworkers' conversations seemed to pause when I walked by. "Want to grab coffee and talk about it?" he asked, perching on the edge of my desk in a way that was just a little too familiar. Before I could answer, Janet from accounting appeared at my cubicle. "Cressida, Mr. Peterson wants to see you in his office. Now." The walk to my manager's office felt like a death march. David Peterson was a decent boss, but he had zero tolerance for workplace drama, and the tight expression on his face told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Close the door and have a seat," he said without preamble. I sat down, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Is everything okay, David?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same expression he used when reviewing problem accounts. "I've been getting some concerning reports about your conduct lately." My stomach dropped. "What kind of reports?" "The kind that involve personal phone calls during work hours, inappropriate text messaging, and behavior that's making your coworkers uncomfortable." He opened a folder on his desk. "Would you like to explain why HR has received 3 separate complaints about your interactions with Liam Archer?" Heat flooded my face. "I don't know what you're talking about. Liam and I are just friends. We work together." Friends who exchange dozens of personal messages during work hours. Friends who take extended lunch breaks together. Friends who have been observed in what witnesses describe as intimate conversations in the break room. Each accusation felt like a slap. "People are just gossiping. You know how this place is." "Cressida, I'm going to be very clear with you. This company has strict policies about workplace relationships and professional conduct. If you can't maintain appropriate boundaries, we'll have to take formal action." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the evidence was right there in his folder. Printed emails, time-stamped security logs, witness statements from coworkers who'd apparently been watching my every move. "I understand," I said finally, hating how small my voice sounded. "Good. Consider this your official warning. Any further incidents will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination." I walked back to my desk in a daze, acutely aware of every whispered conversation, every sideways glance. Liam was waiting for me, his expression concerned. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "We need to be more careful," I whispered, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Peterson knows about us. Knows about what? We haven't done anything wrong. But even as he said it, I could see the calculation in his eyes. Liam was ambitious, and a workplace scandal wouldn't do his career any favors. Maybe we should cool things down for a while, he said, and I heard the distance already creeping into his voice. The rest of the day dragged by in a haze of paranoia and regret. Every email felt monitored, every conversation stilted. When I finally escaped to my car at 5 o'clock, I was surprised to see Graeme's sedan parked across the street. Not Graeme himself, just his car, sitting in the parking lot of Morrison & Associates, the law firm that handled corporate contracts for half the businesses in town. My blood turned to ice as I realized what that might mean. I drove home in a panic, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he was just handling some work-related legal issue. Maybe it was about his mother's estate planning. Maybe it had nothing to do with our marriage. But when I walked into our house and saw Maya sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while Graeme cooked dinner with mechanical precision, I knew I was kidding myself. "How was work?" he asked without turning around, his tone perfectly polite and completely empty. "Fine," I lied. "How was yours?" "Productive." The conversation died there, leaving only the sound of Maya's pencil scratching across her worksheet and the methodical chopping of vegetables. It was like living with a stranger who happened to share my last name. After dinner, after Maya was tucked into bed, with more questions about why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking, I found Graeme back in his study. This time, the door was open, but the message was clear. I could look, but I wouldn't find anything. "I saw your car today," I said from the doorway. "Did you?" "At Morrison & Associates." He looked up from his computer, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the old Graeme, the man who used to tell me everything, who never kept secrets. "I'm exploring my options, Cressida." "What kind of options?" "The kind that protect Maya's interests, and mine." The casual way he said it, like he was discussing the weather, made my chest tight with fear. "Graeme, please. We don't need lawyers. We can work this out ourselves." "Can we?" He saved whatever he was working on and closed the laptop. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've already made your choice." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" He stood up, and I was reminded of how tall he was, how solid. "Tell me, Cressida, when you close your eyes at night, whose face do you see? When your phone buzzes, whose name are you hoping to see? When you imagine your future, am I in it?" I opened my mouth to lie, to tell him what he wanted to hear, but the words wouldn't come, because the honest answer was complicated, messy, and would probably destroy what little hope we had left. "That's what I thought," he said quietly, and walked past me toward the stairs. I stood alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of a life being methodically dismantled, and realized that my joke at the restaurant hadn't just hurt Graeme's feelings. It had given him permission to stop fighting for us. The next few weeks passed in a surreal dance of polite domesticity and underlying tension. Graeme maintained his routine with military precision: breakfast with Maya, work, dinner preparation, bedtime stories. But it was like living with an actor, playing the role of my husband, rather than the man himself. I tried to bridge the gap, making his favorite meals, suggesting we watch movies together, even buying tickets to a concert I knew he'd enjoy. Each gesture was met with polite thanks and gentle deflection. "That's very thoughtful, Cressida, but I have some work to catch up on. Maybe another time. I'm pretty tired tonight." "Why don't you ask Rhea to go with you? I'm sure she'd enjoy it more than I would." The rejection was killing me slowly, made worse by the fact that I couldn't even complain about it. He wasn't being cruel or vindictive, he was just absent, present in body but completely unreachable emotionally. Meanwhile, things at work had become increasingly uncomfortable. Liam's sudden distance was as obvious as his previous attention had been. He'd moved his lunch hour to avoid mine, kept our interactions strictly professional, and started dating someone from the marketing department with obvious enthusiasm. Guess he moved on pretty quickly, Janet commented one day, watching Liam laugh with his new girlfriend by the copy machine. Men like that always do. The observation stung more than it should have. I'd told myself that what Liam and I had was special, that the connection was real. Watching him transfer his attention so easily made me question everything I'd thought I knew about our relationship. It was Maya who finally forced the issue that had been building for weeks. "Mummy, are you and Daddy getting divorced?" The question came out of nowhere during a Saturday morning breakfast. Graeme was at his mother's house, giving us some space that felt more like abandonment. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because Tommy's parents got divorced, and he said first they stopped sleeping in the same room, then they stopped talking, then his daddy moved out." Her 8-year-old logic was devastatingly accurate. "Is Daddy going to move out?" I knelt down beside her chair, taking her small hands in mine. "Daddy and I are just working through some problems, baby. Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out. But you still love him, right?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized I didn't know how to answer it. Did I love Graeme? I'd thought I did, but if that was true, how had I let things get so far with Liam? How had I reached the point where I was comparing my husband to another man and finding him lacking? "It's complicated, Maya." That's what Tommy's mum said too. Then his daddy moved to an apartment. That afternoon, while Maya was at a friend's house, I decided to search Graeme's study for some clue about what he was planning. I knew it was wrong, knew it was a violation of whatever trust we had left, but the uncertainty was eating me alive. His desk was locked, but I knew where he kept the spare key. Inside, I found a world of careful documentation that made my blood run cold. Bank statements showing the gradual movement of funds from our joint accounts to ones with only his name. Printouts of text messages between Liam and me, somehow obtained and highlighted with clinical precision. Screenshots of my social media activity, my work schedule, even photos of us together at company events. But it was the folder labeled Custody Documentation that made my hands shake. Inside were Maya's school records, medical history, a detailed schedule of my work hours and travel. Character references from his family, his co-workers, even some of our former friends. At the bottom of the pile was a USB drive labeled simply Evidence. I plugged it into his computer with trembling fingers, and what I found there destroyed any illusion I'd had about Graeme's emotional state. He wasn't just hurt or confused. He was methodically building a case. Videos of me arriving home late, time-stamped and dated. Audio recordings of phone conversations I'd thought were private. Screenshots of every text, every email, every social media interaction with Liam going back months. The most damning was a recording from the night of our restaurant fight. Someone had captured the entire conversation on their phone, and Graeme had somehow obtained a copy. Hearing my own voice saying those cruel things, seeing the pain on his face in the background, made me physically sick. But it was the final folder that broke me completely. Dissolution timeline. Graeme had mapped out our separation with the same attention to detail he brought to project management at work. Custody schedules, property division, even a proposed timeline for telling Maya and our families. According to his notes, I had 2 weeks before he filed papers. I was still staring at the screen when I heard his car in the driveway. I frantically closed everything, returned the USB drive to its hiding place, and locked the desk drawer. By the time he walked into the house, I was in the kitchen pretending to clean counters that were already spotless. "How was your mother's?" I asked, my voice higher than normal. "Fine. She asked about you." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That we're having some difficulties." He moved through the kitchen with his usual efficiency, gathering ingredients for dinner. The domesticity of it felt surreal, given what I'd just discovered. "Graeme, we need to talk." "About what?" "About us. About what's happening to our marriage." He paused in his meal preparation, his back still turned to me. "What would you like to discuss, Cressida?" I want to fix this. I want to try counseling, or therapy, or whatever it takes. Do you? He turned around, and I was struck again by how tired he looked. Or do you just want to avoid the consequences of your choices? That's not fair. Isn't it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you only became interested in saving our marriage when you realized I might actually leave. The accuracy of his observation was like a slap. I made a mistake. I know that. But doesn't 8 years of marriage count for something? Doesn't Maya deserve to have her parents try to work things out? Maya deserves to grow up in a home where her parents respect each other, where her mother doesn't humiliate her father in public restaurants, where love isn't conditional on comparison to other people. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, cutting deeper than any shouted argument could have. I never meant for things to go this far with Liam. How far did they go, Cressida? The question hung between us like a loaded weapon. I could lie, minimize, make it sound like less than it was. But looking at Graeme's face, I realized he probably already knew the answer. We didn't sleep together. That's not what I asked. We had lunch a few times. We talked. We texted. That's all. And you fell in love with him. It wasn't a question, and I couldn't deny it, because somewhere in those lunches and conversations and late-night texts, I had fallen in love with Liam. Or at least, I'd fallen in love with the way he made me feel. Desired, interesting, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I thought I did, I whispered, and now I realize it was just fantasy. It wasn't real. Graeme nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. The problem, Cressida, is that while you were living in a fantasy, I was living in reality. And in reality, my wife stopped loving me and started loving someone else. I never stopped loving you. Didn't you? He moved closer, and for a moment I thought he might touch me. Instead, he just studied my face like he was memorizing it. Because love isn't just a feeling, Cressida. It's a choice. It's choosing your partner every day, even when someone else seems more exciting. It's protecting what you've built together instead of tearing it down for something that sparkles. I can choose you now. I want to choose you. But you didn't choose me when it mattered. You chose him, and now you want me to pretend that never happened, to go back to the way things were before you decided I wasn't enough. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable, made worse by the fact that I'd caused it. What can I do, Graeme? How do I fix this? He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't think you can, Cressida. I think some things, once broken, can't be put back together. That night, I lay in our empty bed, listening to the sounds of him moving around in the guest room, and realized that I'd spent so much time looking for something better that I'd destroyed something good, and now it might be too late to get it back. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was getting Maya ready for school. Cressida, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from Riverside Family Counseling. Your husband called to schedule an emergency session for this Friday. He said you'd both be available at 2 o'clock. I glanced at Graeme, who was calmly buttering Maya's toast, as if he hadn't just ambushed me with couples therapy. Yes, Friday at 2 is fine. Excellent. Please bring any relevant documentation you feel might be helpful for our discussion. After I hung up, Graeme continued his breakfast routine without acknowledging what had just happened. Documentation? I asked. Dr. Martinez likes to review any evidence that might help her understand the situation. Text messages, emails, that sort of thing. The casual way he said it made my stomach clench. Graeme, what exactly are you planning to tell her? The truth, Cressida. I thought that's what you wanted. Friday arrived with all the dread of an execution date. I'd spent the week trying to prepare for whatever Graeme might reveal, but nothing could have readied me for the methodical way he dismantled our marriage in front of a stranger. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a direct manner that made lying impossible. She started with standard questions about our relationship history, our communication patterns, our individual concerns. Graeme, You mentioned on the phone that there's been a betrayal of trust. Would you like to elaborate? I expected anger, emotion, the kind of messy breakdown that would make him look unstable. Instead, Graeme reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. I've documented everything chronologically, he said, handing it to Dr. Martinez. Text messages, call logs, witness statements from the restaurant incident. I thought it would be more efficient than trying to explain everything verbally. Dr. Martinez opened the folder, and I watched her expression change as she reviewed the contents. Screenshots of my messages with Liam, time-stamped and highlighted. Photos from company events where we stood too close together. Even the receipt from the restaurant where I'd humiliated Graeme publicly. Cressida, Dr. Martinez said finally, how would you characterize your relationship with this Liam person? It was just a friendship that got a little too personal. We never crossed any physical lines. But emotional lines were crossed. I glanced at Graeme, who was watching me with that same clinical detachment he'd shown for weeks. I suppose so, yes. And the comment you made at the restaurant about your husband not measuring up to your ex, can you help me understand the context of that statement? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could try to minimize it, explain it away, make it sound like less than it was. But with Graeme's evidence spread across Dr. Martinez's desk, denial seemed pointless. I was angry. Graeme had been distant and I felt neglected. I said something cruel to hurt him. Did it work? What do you mean? Did it hurt him the way you intended? I looked at Graeme, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight. Not anger or hatred, but something infinitely worse. Disappointment. Yes, I whispered. It did. Dr. Martinez made notes on her pad, then turned to Graeme. How did that comment make you feel? Relieved, he said simply. Both Dr. Martinez and I stared at him in surprise. Relieved, the therapist prompted. For months I'd been wondering if I was imagining things, if I was being paranoid or insecure. When Cressida said I didn't measure up to Liam, it confirmed what I'd already suspected, that she'd emotionally left our marriage and was just going through the motions. And how did that realization affect your feelings about the relationship? Graeme was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but sad. It made me understand that the woman I married, the woman I fell in love with, wouldn't have said something so deliberately cruel. Which means either she's changed into someone I don't recognize, or I never really knew her at all. The words hit like physical blows. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but Dr. Martinez was already moving on. Cressida, Graeme has provided extensive documentation of what he perceives as emotional infidelity. Do you dispute any of these facts? I flipped through the folder, seeing my betrayal laid out in black and white. The progression was undeniable. Innocent work conversations evolving into personal confessions. Friendship morphing into something that had threatened my marriage. No, I said finally. I don't dispute the facts. But you dispute the interpretation. I think Graeme is making this seem worse than it was. Yes, I developed feelings for someone else, but I never acted on them physically. I never intended for it to go as far as it did. Intention doesn't negate impact, Dr. Martinez observed. Graeme, given what we've discussed today, what outcome are you hoping for from counseling? I held my breath, praying he'd say he wanted to save our marriage, that he was willing to work through this. I want Cressida to understand the full consequences of her choices, he said instead. And I want us to develop a co-parenting plan that prioritizes Maya's well-being during our separation. The word separation hit me like a physical blow. Graeme, no. We can work through this. People recover from affairs all the time. Do they recover from public humiliation? From having their worth as a partner questioned in front of their family? From being compared to another man and found lacking? I was angry. You were honest, he interrupted, his voice still maddeningly calm. Maybe for the first time in months you were completely honest about how you really felt. Dr. Martinez intervened before I could respond. I think we should schedule individual sessions before proceeding with couples work. There are clearly some personal issues that need to be addressed separately. The drive home was silent except for Maya's chatter about her school day. Graeme had taken his own car, claiming he needed to run errands. I suspected those errands involved more meetings with lawyers. That evening, while Maya watched cartoons, I tried one last desperate attempt at reconciliation. "Graeme, please, don't give up on us. I know I hurt you, but we can get past this. We have history, we have Maya, we have a life together." He looked up from the legal documents he was reviewing, not even trying to hide them anymore. "Cressida, answer me honestly. If Liam had asked you to leave me, would you have done it?" The question caught me off guard. That's not an answer. I thought about those weeks when Liam's attention had made me feel alive again, when our conversations had been the highlight of my day, when I'd fantasized about a different life. "I don't know," I whispered. Graeme nodded like he'd expected that response. "That's why this is over, Cressida. Because a wife who truly loves her husband doesn't have to think about that question." The next morning, I found our joint bank account had been frozen. When I called to complain, the customer service representative informed me that one account holder had requested a hold pending legal proceedings. That afternoon, there was an envelope taped to our refrigerator. Service of process, dissolution of marriage. Graeme had filed for divorce. I sat at our kitchen table, reading through the papers with shaking hands. Irreconcilable differences. Requests for joint custody. Division of assets. The methodical dismantling of 8 years of marriage, reduced to legal terminology and court dates. When Maya came home from school, she found me crying at the kitchen table. "Mummy, what's wrong?" "Daddy and we're going to live in separate houses for a while." "Like Tommy's parents?" "Yes, sweetheart, like Tommy's parents." She was quiet for a long moment, then climbed into my lap with the devastating acceptance that children show in the face of adult failures. "Will I still see Daddy every day?" "We'll work something out, baby. We'll make sure you see Daddy lots." But even as I made the promise, I wondered if Graeme would be as generous with custody as he'd been with everything else, or if his methodical approach to our divorce would extend to limiting my access to the one thing I couldn't bear to lose. That night, alone in our bed while Graeme packed boxes in the guest room, I realized that my joke about him never measuring up had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He'd finally decided I was right. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and custody negotiations. Graeme had moved into a furnished apartment across town, taking only his clothes and personal items. He left everything else, the house, the furniture, even the photos of our family, as if he was erasing himself from our life rather than fighting for his share. His lawyer, Patricia Morrison, was a sharp woman in her 40s who treated our divorce like a business transaction. She was professional but cold, and it was clear she viewed me as the villain in this story. "Your husband is being extremely generous," she told me during our first mediation session. "He's not asking for alimony. He's leaving you the house and most of the assets, and he's only requesting joint custody of Maya. Frankly, given the evidence of your emotional affair, he could ask for much more." The evidence. Always the evidence. Graeme had documented everything with such thoroughness that my own lawyer, a tired-looking man named Robert Chen, advised me to accept whatever terms were offered. "You don't have much leverage here, Cressida. The text messages, the witness statements from the restaurant, the workplace complaints, it all paints a picture of someone who destroyed their marriage for another man. If this goes to trial, it won't be pretty." But it was the custody arrangement that broke my heart. Graeme wanted Maya every other weekend and one evening per week. Standard divorced dad visitation, except Graeme had never been a standard dad. He'd been the one who did bedtime stories, helped with homework, attended every school event. "Why are you only asking for weekends?" I asked him during one of our awkward handoff conversations. You could get more time if you wanted. Because Maya needs stability, he said simply. And despite everything, you're still her mother. The generosity of it made me feel worse than any anger could have. It was Edith who finally made me understand the full scope of what I'd lost. You had a good man, Cressida, she said when she came to collect some of Graeme's remaining belongings. A man who loved you completely, who never looked at another woman, who built his whole life around you and Maya. And you threw it away for what? Some fantasy about a man who disappeared the moment things got complicated. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? Edith's voice was sharp with disgust. Mistakes are forgetting anniversaries or leaving dishes in the sink. What you did was deliberate and cruel. You humiliated my son in public, compared him to another man, and made him feel like he wasn't enough. That's not a mistake, Cressida. That's character. After she left with Graeme's books and photo albums, I sat in our empty house and tried to figure out where it had all gone wrong. When had I stopped appreciating what I had and started looking for something better? When had Graeme's steadiness become boring instead of comforting? When had I convinced myself that I deserved more than a man who loved me unconditionally? The final divorce hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November. I dressed carefully, hoping to project an image of respectability, but I felt like a fraud in my conservative suit and modest jewelry. Graeme was already there when I arrived, sitting with Patricia Morrison and looking more composed than I'd ever seen him. He'd lost weight during our separation, and there was a new sharpness to his features that made him look older but somehow more attractive. All rise for the Honourable Judge Rebecca Walsh. Judge Walsh was a no-nonsense woman who clearly had little patience for marital drama. She reviewed our settlement agreement with brisk efficiency, asking pointed questions about custody arrangements and asset division. Mr. Vale, you're not requesting any spousal support despite an 8-year marriage. Is this decision made under duress? No, Your Honour. I'm capable of supporting myself, and I want a clean break. Mrs. Vale, do you have any objections to the terms as outlined? I looked at Graeme, hoping for some sign that he might change his mind, that we might find a way back to each other. But his expression was neutral, professional, like he was concluding a business deal. No objections, Your Honour. Very well. I hereby grant the dissolution of marriage between Graeme Vale and Cressida Vale. Custody of the minor child, Maya Vale, will be shared as outlined in the agreement. Mr. Vale, you're free to resume your maiden name if you choose. The gavel came down with a sound that felt final in a way I hadn't expected. 8 years of marriage dissolved in less than 20 minutes. Outside the courthouse, Graeme paused on the steps. For a moment, I thought he might say something, offer some closure or final words. Graeme, I'll pick up Maya on Friday at 6, he said without looking at me. Please have her overnight bag ready. That's it? That's all you have to say to me? He turned then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Not anger or hatred, but a kind of peaceful resolution that was somehow worse than any emotion would have been. What would you like me to say, Cressida? That I forgive you? I do. That I understand why you did what you did. I'm trying to. That I hope you find what you're looking for. I genuinely do. But I also hope you understand what you lost. Because someday, when the excitement wears off and you're looking for someone who will love you despite your flaws, you'll remember that you had that. And you chose to throw it away for a man who couldn't even be bothered to fight for you when things got difficult. The words hit like a physical blow, made worse by the gentle way he delivered them. Liam and I aren't together, I said quietly. We never were, really. I know. I also know that doesn't change anything, because it was never really about him, was it? It was about the fact that you stopped believing I was enough. He walked away then, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps with the devastating realization that he was absolutely right. 6 months later, I was living alone in our house, working a job I hated after being quietly forced out of my position for workplace conduct issues. Maya spent her weekends with Graeme, coming home with stories about his new apartment, his cooking experiments, the books they read together. "Daddy seems happier," she told me one Sunday evening. "He smiles more now." The observation stung, but I couldn't deny its truth. In the few interactions I'd had with Graeme during custody exchanges, he did seem lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I'd heard through mutual friends that he was dating someone, a teacher named Sarah who Maya adored. They weren't living together, weren't rushing into anything, but Maya's casual mentions of Sarah's cookies and Sarah's garden painted a picture of a man building a new life with someone who appreciated what she had. Meanwhile, I was alone in a house that felt too big, working a job that barely paid the bills, and slowly understanding the difference between excitement and love, between fantasy and reality, between what glitters and what lasts. I'd thought Graeme would never measure up to my ex. I was right, but not in the way I'd meant. He'd measured up to something far more important. He'd been a man of character, integrity, and genuine love, and I'd been too foolish to see it until it was gone.